The killer melted under pressure, but not before dessert. Welcome to Mystery Parlor. I am your host, Axon. Let me know in the comments, where are you joining us from today? Every message from you adds magic to the mystery. Let's begin. I don't pretend to understand the symphony that plays inside Nero Wolfe's head when he's thinking, but I do know this. Interrupting him mid-thought is about as wise as tossing a pebble into an active volcano and hoping it'll cool things down. Which is why when the doorbell rang at 2:41 on a Thursday afternoon, right in the middle of Wolfe's post-lunch session with Horace the Orchid, I hesitated at the threshold, like a guy waiting for a green light that might never come. Still, it's my job to answer the door, so I did. She was carrying a cardboard carrier with 4 metal-topped pint cartons and had the air of someone who knew she was being stared at. Tall, early 30s, thin but healthy, wearing slacks that cost real money and a silk blouse that knew what a dry cleaner was. Her hair was arranged like she'd tried not to arrange it too much. The effect was effortless, which meant it took effort. "Is this the residence of Mr. Nero Wolfe?" she asked, balancing the cartons with one hand and pushing her sunglasses up with the other. "I'm not here socially." "They never are," I said, holding the door a little wider. "You've got 10 seconds to convince me this is worth interrupting him, or you and your dairy-based peace offering head back to wherever you came from." She gave me a direct look that didn't blink. "My name is Natalie Voss. Someone broke into my ice cream shop last night, but they didn't take anything, except one batch of experimental product. That batch is what's going to launch the business nationally. If it gets into the wrong hands, it could kill the deal we've spent 6 months negotiating with Braemar Foods. I need Mr. Wolfe to find out who took it and why." I glanced down at the box. The name on the side, Crème Voss, meant something. Fritz had raved about their brown sugar fig swirl last week. Wolfe had allowed it to be served with poached apricots. That was practically endorsement by canonization. "Okay," I said. "I'll warn you, he doesn't take cases that involve refrigeration unless his appetite is involved. And even then, it better be a damn interesting story. Come in." She sat on the red settee in the office, still balancing the box. I gave Wolfe the nod from the doorway, and he closed the orchid room with all the solemnity of a man leaving a confessional. When he saw the logo on the box, one of his eyebrows climbed a rung. "Miss Voss," I said, "meet Nero Wolfe. He doesn't shake hands. He does accept bribes in the form of premium desserts. Whether he listens after that is entirely up to him." Wolfe settled into his chair and waved a hand. "Explain, briefly." Miss Voss did a good job of it. Crème Voss was a 2-year-old boutique ice cream company with high-end ingredients, low production volume, and a marketing plan aimed squarely at making hedge fund wives feel virtuous about eating dessert. Their new flavor, tentatively named Sunlight and Sin, was developed in secret with a Michelin-starred pastry chef who'd signed an NDA tighter than Wolfe's waistcoat buttons. It was going to be their showcase at the Braemar Foods pitch in 3 days, but when Natalie showed up at the shop that morning, the walk-in freezer had been broken into, and only the 6 test pints of Sunlight and Sin were gone. No other stock. Touched. No cash register, no electronics, not even the designer spoons. "It wasn't theft," she concluded. "It was sabotage. I have competitors, enemies even. But I can't go to the police without risking publicity. The deal dies if word gets out." Wolfe pressed the tips of his fingers together. "And you believe that the stolen formula will be used to poison your pitch, figuratively or otherwise?" She nodded. "That flavor is everything. One leak, one premature launch, and Braemar pulls out. We get crushed in court and we're ruined." Poi. Wolfe looked over at me. "Archie, the names of her staff, all of them. Anyone with access to the kitchen and freezer." I blinked. "You're taking the case?" He scowled. "Don't be obtuse. Fritz said their Madagascar vanilla redefines the term. That earns at least a list of names." Natalie Voss exhaled like a diver reaching air. "I have the list right here." She handed me a folded sheet. I scanned it. 5 names: manager, pastry liaison, night cleaner, accountant/fiancé, and 1 temp freezer tech brought in to recalibrate the coils 3 days ago. "This is going to take some legwork," I said. "It usually does," Wolfe replied. "Begin with the night cleaner. I presume he had the freedom of the place." "He's been with us from the start," Natalie said. "He's loyal." "Bah. Loyalty is an emotion. I require behavior." When she left 20 minutes later, minus 1 pint Wolfe had claimed for preliminary examination, I raised an eyebrow at him from my spot by the globe. "You're taking food theft seriously now?" "Archie," he said without opening his eyes, "ice cream is the last pleasure a civilized man can indulge without moral inquiry. If someone uses it for war, I must respond." I made a note in my pocket notebook, which I don't usually do. Check freezer guy and the fiancé. People do strange things for love, money, or frozen dairy. Next step, I was heading out to scoop the suspects. I started with Felix Mancuso, the night cleaner, because Wolfe's instincts are like truffles, underground, mysterious and irritatingly accurate. The guy had been on the payroll since Creme Voss opened its first storefront in Soho, and Natalie made him sound like the kind of loyal employee that hands in found pennies and attends staff birthday parties. That's usually your first red flag. I tracked Felix to a 6th-floor walk-up in Astoria. He opened the door with the kind of cautious half-crack that made me flash my license just to speed things along. He was mid-50s, wiry, with the kind of nervous energy you'd expect from someone who cleans up after other people's dreams for a living. His hair was slicked back, but losing the war, and his shirt had a faded Knicks logo that hadn't seen a winning season in over a decade. "Miss Voss said you're with her legal team," he said after I gave him a smooth line about internal investigation procedures and potential insurance ramifications. I didn't correct him. It's amazing how far you can get when people think you work for the lawyers. "Yeah, I'm checking on access, security, and anomalies. You were the last person in the store before the theft." His face tensed, but he stepped aside. I entered a room that looked like it hadn't been decorated so much as given up on. He gestured to a sagging couch, then sat across from me in a final chair that creaked under the weight of unspoken secrets. "Yeah, I was there," he said, "but I didn't see or hear anything. I came in at 10, left by 2, nothing looked out of place." "No alarms?" "None. Back door was locked. Freezer room looked normal." "But," he rubbed the side of his nose, "it did feel colder than usual. I figured maybe they adjusted the settings to keep the new stuff from melting." "The new flavor?" "Yeah. Natalie had us double-wrap the bins. Said it was their shot at the big leagues." "Anyone else there that night?" He hesitated just long enough to make me lean forward. "I thought I heard something around midnight. Footsteps, soft, could have been from upstairs. The tenants above use the fire escape sometimes. But it felt close. That was something." I logged. It thanked him and left him with a look that suggested I'd be back if things got sticky. The second stop was less fruitful. Kieran Blunt, Natalie's fiancé and Cream Idvos's financial controller, worked from a shared office space in Tribeca with exposed brick walls and artisanal coffee so strong it smelled like burnt promises. He had the smooth blandness of a man who never forgot a decimal or his hair product. When I asked about the theft, he gave me the full concern act, eyebrows up, mouth set like a tragic actor in a silent film. "Of course we're upset," he said. "This launch was everything to Natalie, to all of us. Mind if I ask where you were the night it happened?" He didn't blink. "At home. I was doing a spreadsheet audit for a seasonal cost forecast. I have the login time from the server if you need proof." I didn't, but now I did. Too smooth is just as suspicious as too twitchy. He gave me the party line. Nobody had access to the freezer room but him, Natalie, Felix, and sometimes Noémie Leclerc, the pastry consultant. Noémie had been working on the flavor for weeks. Apparently, she had a sense of taste that made food critics weep. By the time I got back to the brownstone, it was 6:30, and my notes looked like a cross between a grocery list and a floor plan for betrayal. Fritz was setting the table, and Wolfe was where God intended. Anchored in his chair, eyes closed, hands laced, not moving unless a fire broke out or a souffle collapsed. I gave him the rundown. Felix heard possible footsteps. Kieran had an alibi made of digits and self-assurance, and the freezer room seemed to be the epicenter of our little culinary crisis. Wolfe opened his eyes. And? Noémie's next. She has access, she has skill, and she's not romantically entangled. With the boss, that's 3 points in her favor. She is French, Wolfe said, like he was announcing the existence of gravity. I raised a brow. You think that makes her guilty? No, it makes her proud. If the formula was hers in part or whole, and she believed herself undercredited or undercompensated, she could have taken it out of spite, not spite. Ownership, he frowned. Archie set an appointment with Miss Leclerc here tomorrow morning. I nodded, just as Fritz stepped in and announced dinner. Beef bourguignon, he said with reverence, accompanied, Wolfe added without hesitation, by a scoop of Miss Voss's stolen legacy. I must evaluate the stakes involved. As I took my seat at the table, I watched Wolfe dip a spoon into the vanilla pint like a theologian approaching sacred text. He took one bite, then another, then nothing. He didn't speak for the rest of the meal, which, if you know Wolfe, was all the statement I needed. By 9:03 the next morning, I had Noémie Leclerc's slender frame seated in the red armchair across from Wolfe, her fingers lightly folded, her chin tilted with a mix of defiance and poise. She was the kind of woman who could hold her own against a maitre d' with attitude, or a client with bad taste. Early 30s, Paris-born, Brooklyn-polished. Her accent was real, but practiced. She wanted you to know she was French, but also that she'd read the New York Times without the need for a dictionary. Wolfe did not rise, of course. His only movement was a slight tilt of the head as she entered, as if assessing an exotic fungus on a new orchid. I understand you worked closely on the flavor Miss Voss calls sunlight and sin, he said without preamble. She smiled with professional restraint. I created it. Wolfe let the silence breathe. Noémie glanced at me, then back at him. Natalie contributed to the concept. She wanted something nostalgic but provocative. I chose the flavor profile, developed the base, sourced the cardamom, and refined the caramel swirl to complement the saffron. It is mine. Yet she refers to it as a company product. She gave a shrug that had enough shrug in it for 2 people. That is the nature of business. You cook, they own. You are dissatisfied with the arrangement? I am paid. Not poorly, but if the launch is successful, I receive a bonus. If the flavor is stolen, I get nothing. You see my interest in this? I do, Wolfe said. Did you know that the pints were kept in a separate freezer? She nodded. I asked for that. Too much air exchange from staff opening the main doors. The saffron would lose its intensity. That tracked with what Natalie had said, which meant either they were singing from the same hymnal or someone had handed out sheet music. Wolfe pressed his fingertips together and stared at them for a moment. Miss Leclerc, who else knew the formula in detail? No one. I prepared the infusions and the measurements myself. The rest of the staff merely churned, poured, and packed. You recorded your notes? I keep a tasting journal, in French, coded. Even if someone stole it, they'd find only suggestions, not secrets. I filed that away. A woman with a locked journal and something to prove. That can go either way in this business. Wolfe shifted in his chair, which for him is like other men leaping onto a table. You were not at the store the night of the theft? I was at home making sorbet. She smiled faintly, for a man who did not deserve it. Can that be verified? No. The smile vanished. But I am not lying. That concluded the interview. Wolfe dismissed her with a nod, and She left the room with a grace that made the door seem lucky to close behind her. I turned to him as soon as the knob clicked. "You buy it?" He closed his eyes. "If I believed only what was verifiable, I should never eat or hire anyone." "That's comforting." He waved it away. "Her pride is genuine, her disappointment real. But she did not take the pints. If she had, she would not be sitting here describing their exact molecular flavor harmony. She would not risk exposure. No, Mr. Goodwin, the culprit is more indirect." Before I could respond, the phone rang. It was Saul Panzer. Wolfe had summoned him the day before, and when Saul gets called in, it means we're past ice cream and into something serious. I handed the receiver to Wolfe, who listened without interrupting. When he hung up, he looked at me. "Someone has approached Braemar Foods yesterday afternoon, anonymously, offering a preliminary taste experience in exchange for an exclusive contract. The flavor matches Miss Voss's description." "Brazen," I said, "but dumb." "Not necessarily. The pints were stolen, not the formula. If the pitch is successful, Braemar signs, Craimid Voss sues, the seller delays. Eventually someone settles, the thief profits, and Natalie loses everything." "Precisely." I stood. "You want me to lean on Braemar?" "No. I want you to lean on the one person we haven't yet disturbed." "The technician." I flipped my notebook. "Logan. Price, temp freezer guy. Hired through a facility contractor. Checked in last Friday, out by Monday. Find him." I found him. Logan Price was the kind of guy you could lose in a lineup of mannequins. Medium height, medium build, medium energy. He met me at a diner in Red Hook, where the coffee tasted like burnt rope, and the waitress didn't believe in second chances. He was cooperative but cautious. "I was called in to recalibrate the humidity controls on the walk-in," he said, stirring his cream with too much focus. "Nothing unusual, except a signature batch went missing a day later. I was long gone. Still, you had access." He stiffened. "I'm a contractor. I do HVAC, not espionage." "Logan," I said, tapping my notebook, "you were there the same weekend. Noemi did a private test batch, the same time Natalie was off-site pitching to investors, and the freezer settings changed, slightly." Felix noticed. He looked at me, his eyes flat. "That room has dozens of settings. I adjusted one for airflow, that's it. Yet you spent an hour in there." "I was slow." "You were thorough, that's good. But Braemar got an anonymous call yesterday. Someone who knew what the flavor was and had a sample." He didn't blink. "I didn't take anything," he said finally. "But someone else was there Saturday afternoon. I was finishing up and the back door opened, a guy in a suit. Didn't give his name. Talked to the manager, then left. I thought he was an investor." "Did you get a good look?" "Sure. Mid-40s, dark hair, expensive shoes, briefcase. Looked like he could buy the building." "Interesting. That description didn't match anyone I'd spoken to. Could you identify him?" Logan hesitated, then nodded. "Probably. I paid the check and left him with a tip and a warning." Back at the brownstone, Wolfe took in the update with one of his trademark low growls. An unknown visitor, on the weekend, while the formula sat unguarded. Could have bribed someone, or taken a sample himself. Possibly, or perhaps he was already known to someone there. "You think this mystery man is the thief?" "I think," Wolfe said slowly, "we must now ask, who benefits most if Natalie Voss fails? And who had the ability to offer Braemar a replacement?" I thought about that. "Her fiancé," I said. "Kieran's the finance guy. He'd know the value, have access and connections. But why sabotage something he's part of? Perhaps he's no longer part of it, or never intended to be." Wolfe closed his eyes. "Again, call Saul. Have him trace Kieran Blunt's financials for the last 3 months, investments, private meetings, anonymous corporations. Something stinks." I didn't say it out loud, but I was thinking it. This whole thing was turning. Colder than a 10 below freezer full of betrayal, Wolfe was circling the scent, and soon someone was going to get served. By the time Saul Panzer walked into the brownstone the next morning, his coat was damp from the April drizzle, and his expression was the kind that said he'd followed a thread and found a noose. He handed Wolfe a slim manila folder, stood silently while Wolfe read it, and left with a nod to me. Saul's a man of few words and less paid to use them, but he always delivers the kind that count. Wolfe took his time with the report. I knew better than to interrupt, so I busied myself refilling my coffee cup and staring out the window at the grey slush that passes for spring in New York. The only sound was the rustle of paper and the occasional exhalation from Wolfe that signaled mental digestion was underway. Finally, he closed the folder, tapped it once with his fingers and said, "Archie, we are closer than they think." "That's good," I said, "because so far this case has more moving parts than Fritz's lamb ragout." Wolfe ignored me, which was fine. I'd learned to take his silences as compliments, or at least as signs he wasn't preparing to throw me out. "Kieran Blunt," he said, "has been making regular payments into an offshore shell account. It's registered in the Caymans, under the name of a consulting firm that has no public clients. It was created 7 weeks ago, about the same time Miss Voss began finalizing her pitch to Braemar." "Could be prep for a wedding," I said. "Honeymoon fund." Wolfe shook his head. "The amounts are too precise, all identical. $4,444 every Friday. That is not sentiment. That is laundering." "That's an oddly satisfying number," it is also a classic psychological pattern used by individuals who believe themselves clever. He's daring someone to notice. "Okay," I said, warming to it. "So the fiancé's been hiding something. We knew he had access, but now we've got motive. But how does that tie to the mystery visitor Logan saw?" "I believe we are dealing with two operations. One, the theft of the formula. Two, the replacement of the deal, separate hands but joined intent. Mr. Blunt may not have stolen the ice cream. He may have merely made the theft worthwhile. So he sells Natalie out to Braemar." Wolfe leaned back. "Not Braemar directly, but perhaps to a competitor, someone who wants Braemar's attention and Natalie's ruin. Kieran leaks the pitch, the formula vanishes, and suddenly a rival brand shows up with a miracle dessert no one's ever tasted." He turned toward me. "Find out who Braemar's other appointments were this week, particularly anyone who approached them after the theft. Use Saul if you must. I want names, Archie. Names, locations, and intentions." I gave him a salute. "On it." Saul worked fast, and within 6 hours I had a name. Braemar had taken a surprise meeting on Wednesday morning with a startup called Alpine Creamery, supposedly Swiss-backed, run by a silent investor and a rotating team of branding experts. Their angle, old-world flavors with modern luxury packaging. They'd shown up with no appointment, but a sample so persuasive that Braemar's senior buyer extended the meeting from 10 minutes to 45. No contracts were signed, but discussions had begun. I dug deeper. Alpine Creamery didn't exist before March. The founder, one Elias Drexler, was a ghost. No LinkedIn, no tax filings, no food service permits. But the registered address led to a mail forwarding facility in Queens, and the business phone was a burner that never answered. That was enough to go on. I paid another visit to Kieran Blunt. This time I didn't bother calling ahead. I caught him stepping out of his WeWork cubicle, latte in one hand, phone in the other. His expression changed when he saw me. Less confident, more calculating. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, managing a smile. "More questions?" "Just one," I said, stepping in close. "Who is Elias Drexler?" He blinked, his mouth opened, closed, opened again. "I don't know who that is." "Try again." Look, I've been under stress. Natalie's under pressure. The company's future is uncertain. I held up a printout. This is the shell account you've been feeding. Same name shows up on Alpine Creamery's proxy filing. A week after you moved money into it, their miracle flavor showed up at Braemar's table. He tried to laugh. That's circumstantial. It's theft and betrayal. His eyes darted to the hallway. You can't prove anything. Wolfe. Can he will. The only question is whether you want to help yourself while there's still a version of this story where you're a dupe instead of the architect. He ran a hand through his hair. It wasn't supposed to go this far. I never wanted Natalie to lose the pitch, just to force her hand. She wasn't letting me in on the equity. So you sold her out. I gave Drexler the specs, just the basics. He said he had the lab, the contacts. I thought it would spook her into renegotiating. Then the pints disappeared, and I knew he'd gone further. Who is he? Ex-employee of Braemar. He's been trying to break into the market for years. Uses fronts, fake names. He said this was his last shot. And now it's yours, I said, pocketing the printout. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe listened with what passed for approval. He didn't nod, but he didn't interrupt either. When I finished, he said, "Have Miss Voss return tonight, 8 o'clock, and invite Mr. Blunt, with civility." You want them in the same room? Of course. The truth is, a dish best. Served cold, preferably with a spoon. They both arrived within minutes of each other. I offered them chairs, but Wolfe didn't wait for pleasantries. He dove in. "Miss Voss," he said, "your formula was stolen, not by an intruder, but by a weakness in your trust. Mr. Blunt, acting independently and with ambition unbecoming of a fiancé, shared key details with a business rival. That rival, styling himself Elias Drexler, reconstructed your flavor profile and used stolen samples to dazzle Braemar." Kieran opened his mouth, but Wolfe held up a hand. "No interruptions." He turned to Natalie. "You were sabotaged not by enemies, but by those who thought themselves allies. Mr. Blunt acted from greed, not malice. But the consequence is the same." Natalie stared at Kieran. Her face was unreadable. When she spoke, it was soft. "Is it true?" He nodded. "I didn't mean—" She didn't let him finish. She stood and turned to Wolfe. "What happens now?" Wolfe folded his hands. "You retain your deal. I have contacted Braemar, provided documentation. They will investigate Alpine Creamery's origin. Mr. Blunt will resign his post. Quietly. If you wish to prosecute, the evidence is yours." She nodded slowly. "Thank you." "Phooey," Wolfe said. "Thank me by sending more of that fig and honey combination, with restraint." She almost smiled. As they left, Kieran broken, Natalie steel-backed, I looked at Wolfe. "You didn't mention the missing pints." "They are irrelevant. The flavor matters. The idea. Those cartons were only vessels. Still, I'd like to know where they went." Wolfe closed his eyes. "Ask Fritz. He found them tucked behind a pheasant roast last night. Someone moved them for storage. The theft, as it happens, was never physical." I stared. "So no break-in?" "No. Merely misdirection. But the conspiracy— ah, that was very real." He opened his eyes and reached for his glass. "Justice, Archie, is best achieved not through action, but appetite." It was the kind of aftermath that didn't leave bodies, just bruises. Emotional, financial, reputational. Wolfe had declared the matter settled, and to him, that meant the entire affair now belonged to the same category as used napkins and opera tickets, a thing no longer fit for attention. I wasn't so easily satisfied. The freezer pints had turned up, hidden behind Fritz's pheasant, and Wolfe insisted the rest had been psychological warfare, not felony. But something still clinked when I shook the box of facts. It wasn't just the betrayal by Kieran or the Swiss-scented scam Elias Drexler tried to pull. It was how neatly the pieces had fallen into place. Too neatly. Wolfe was right about misdirection, But maybe the misdirection was on more than one level. So while Wolfe returned to his orchids and Fritz to his rhubarb custard tarts, I took a little solo detour. First stop, Natalie Voss. She met me at the Crème et Voss storefront, which was closed for private inventory review. That probably meant they were restocking after the FBI free resolution Wolfe had orchestrated. She greeted me with that same polite smile, 1 part gratitude, 2 parts exhaustion. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, ushering me into the tasting room, "I assume you're not here for another scoop." "Only if it comes with answers," I said. "Let's sit." We took stools at the counter. The air smelled like Madagascar vanilla and silent tension. "You got what you wanted," I said. "Kieran's out, Drexler's been exposed, Braemar is back on board. Everyone walks away." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Is that not satisfactory?" "For Wolfe?" "Absolutely. For me." I leaned in a little. "There's still one thing that sticks." "I'm listening." "That freezer. Those pints. You said they were gone. Swore up and down someone had stolen them. You called it sabotage. But it turns out they weren't stolen, just moved, and not by a rival or a ghost in a tailored suit. They were in your own freezer hidden behind a roast." "I didn't know," she said evenly. "I assumed the worst." "Sure, people do, but what I find odd is how specific your claim was. You didn't just say the pints were missing. You said they were all—" "That was missing. Nothing else touched. That's not assumption, that's knowledge." She stayed still, but the corner of her lip twitched. I kept going. "That makes me wonder. What if the theft wasn't a mistake? What if it was a move? A way to smoke out someone? You already suspected." Silence. "You knew Kieran was feeding information to someone. You didn't know who or how far it went, so you staged a theft. You made it look like someone broke in. That forced Wolfe's hand, forced me to start digging." "You're giving me a lot of credit," she said quietly. "Yeah," I said. "I am." She didn't deny it. After a moment she said, "I knew something was wrong. Kieran was too invested in the pitch, but never wanted to talk about the flavor itself. He kept pushing financial projections, growth models. I got suspicious. So yes, I moved the pints, made it look like they were taken. Figured if someone tried to act on it, I'd know. And you called Wolfe. Because I knew he'd see it faster than the police, and he'd expose it without headlines." I let out a slow breath. "You do realize that what you did is technically staging a crime?" "It wasn't a crime. Nothing was taken. I protected my company, and in the end the real thief got caught. I had to admit it was clean. Cold-blooded, maybe, but clever. You ever think of going into espionage?" I asked. "Only ice cream," she said, and gave me that smile again. Back at the brownstone, I considered whether to share this with Wolfe. He wouldn't be surprised. He'd probably already deduced it, but he wouldn't necessarily approve either. Wolfe's moral compass isn't sentimental, but it's precise. He disapproves of lies unless he's telling them, and he doesn't like being used, even elegantly. Still, I said nothing. I'd give it a few days. Let the case settle into memory before reopening any philosophical files. But the moment passed, quicker than I expected, and not in the way I anticipated. That evening, while I was organizing case notes, Wolfe summoned me into the office. "I received a call," he said, without looking up from his crossword. "From Braemar's senior acquisitions officer. He wished to express appreciation for our intervention. Very civic-minded of him. He also mentioned," Wolfe continued, "that Alpine Creamery is still attempting to push its sample. They've claimed Crème Voss's flavor was never exclusive." I frowned. "So they're not backing down?" "No. And Braemar, curious creatures that they are, will entertain their proposal if Natalie fails to deliver the promised product on the agreed launch date." I felt a chill. "You think she's hiding more?" "I think," Wolfe said, "we must be thorough. Alpine could only reproduce the flavor if they had enough to reverse engineer. A bite or two wouldn't suffice, but a full pint would. The missing cartons, I said slowly. She may have given one to Drexler to bait Kieran, or Drexler took it himself if she let him near enough. Wolfe leaned back, laced his fingers over his stomach. Archie. I want you to find Elias Drexler, not the name, the man. Track the fake investor to his real identity. That could take days. You have 2. So I called in a favor from Lon Cohen at the Gazette, then followed the breadcrumb trail of LLC filings and late-night catering receipts. Drexler was a mask, but underneath it was a man named Cal Wender, ex-brand consultant, fired from Braemar for allegedly manipulating supplier contracts. He'd resurfaced under half a dozen aliases, always circling the food world like a shark, who couldn't afford his next swim. I found him in a co-working kitchen in Jersey City, tasting gelato samples with the kind of intensity that would frighten a monk. He didn't recognize me, which made it easy to tail him for the next hour. He made 3 calls, one of which I intercepted with a little trick I picked up in Army. Intelligence. The name he mentioned wasn't Natalie Voss, it was Noémie Leclerc. Now that was a twist. That night, I gave Wolfe the whole rundown. Cal Wender was Drexler. He had a long-standing grudge against Braemar and a recent collaboration with someone inside Creme Voss. That someone wasn't Kieran Blunt, at least not entirely. It was Noémie. She didn't just help make the flavor, I said. She made a second batch, quietly. Gave it to Wender under the table. She played Natalie, played Kieran, and maybe played us. Wolfe didn't react for a long moment, then, why? Same reason as everyone else. Ownership, recognition, maybe money, or maybe just revenge. She was told it was her masterpiece, then watched as Natalie claimed it for the brand. So she sold a pint to Wender and watched the chaos. She knew Kieran would be blamed, and she knew Natalie would survive it. But she gets credit indirectly, and maybe a stake, if Wender's play worked. Wolfe exhaled. Noémie will be removed quietly. Natalie will protect her brand, and Wender will retreat again until his next scam. That's it? That is resolution, not justice. He looked at the last carton of Sunlight and Sin sitting on his desk untouched. Fritz tells me it has a rosewater finish, he said. Delicate, complex, but bitter if melted. Fitting, I said. Wolfe gave a grunt and closed his eyes. The world, Archie, is full of people who mistake flavor for substance, and some who know the difference and still choose the former. I didn't think Wolfe would touch the final pint of Sunlight and Sin. After everything, it had become more than dessert. It was a symbol of deceit, ambition, artistry, betrayal, and whatever else makes people act like chess pieces, trying to outmaneuver each other before the clock runs out. But the next morning I found the pint in the trash, empty, licked clean. You finished it? I asked. Wolfe didn't open his eyes. It was melting, which, from him, meant both literal and metaphysical justification. I didn't press it. Instead, I focused on the next item on our agenda, wrapping up the fallout. The Drexler alias was dead in the water, and Wender had slipped off the grid, again. Braemar had committed, on paper, to Creme Voss, but with one of those vague pending supply chain verification clauses that meant they still had their ears open for alternatives. Natalie Voss had cleaned house. Kieran was gone. Noémie, interestingly, had not been fired but reassigned, quietly demoted to a consulting role with no production access and even less influence. Wolfe said she'd been spared for pragmatic reasons. Losing her publicly would signal to Braemar that something was still rotten behind the freezer door. But something still bothered me. Wolfe, I said around lunchtime, as Fritz laid down a plate of quail eggs with caviar toast soldiers, if Natalie staged the theft and Kieran made the leak and Noémie gave Wender the goods, where exactly does the crime land? Is it all just bad blood and corporate maneuvering? Wolfe took a bite of egg and chewed for a moment like a judge deliberating on a particularly juicy precedent. "There are two types of crime, Archie," he said. "Those that violate statutes and those that violate equilibrium. The former belong to the police, the latter belong to me." "Equilibrium," I echoed. "As in the moral kind? As in the delicate, absurd balance humans strike between pride, desire, and fear? When that is disturbed, chaos seeps in through cracks, and the restoration of order," he added, lifting his fork like a scepter, "requires identification of the true axis of disruption." "And who's that in this case?" He gave me a look. "You tell me." I thought about it. Natalie had manipulated Wolfe, used him to flush out Kieran. Kieran had betrayed her, but not cleverly enough to pull it off. Noemi had made a side deal to reclaim credit, and Drexler, vendor, had seized on a convenient opportunity but never created one. "It's Noemi," I said finally. "She's the one who knew everything. She let the others flail while she made her move." "Correct. She engineered not the crime, but the circumstances in which the crime could flourish. That is the more dangerous offense." Fritz entered with a pot of coffee, which Wolfe ignored. "Are we finished with this one?" I asked. "We are not," Wolfe replied. "Miss Voss has requested one final meeting. She arrives in 20 minutes. She didn't say why. She did not. But she used the phrase, something personal. That can mean anything from a thank-you gift to an emotional breakdown." I set my cup down. "Well, if she brings another mystery flavor, I'm getting a chemical test first." Wolfe gave a small smile. "A wise precaution." Natalie arrived precisely on time, dressed in a cream blazer and no nonsense. Her demeanor had sharpened. Gone was the cautious entrepreneur who had walked into our office bearing frozen diplomacy. This was a woman who had fired a fiancé, neutralized a saboteur, and salvaged a multi-million-dollar pitch with the finesse of a political campaign manager. She declined coffee, but sat. "I wanted to say thank you," she began. "For what you uncovered and for how you handled it." "You handled it," Wolfe corrected. "I manipulated you into handling it," she said with no apology. "But I knew you were the only one who could." Wolfe inclined his head slightly. "You're welcome." She reached into her bag and removed a small envelope. I tensed. Somehow envelopes in this office always carried either checks or confessions, but she passed it across to Wolfe with simple dignity. "Braemar has approved our launch. The flavor goes national next quarter. We're rebranding the name, not Sunlight and Sin, too whimsical for a broad release. We're calling it Equinox. Simpler, stronger." "A shame," Wolfe murmured. "The original name had merit." "I wanted to offer you this," she said, indicating the envelope. "It's not payment, just acknowledgement." Wolfe opened it. Inside was a sleek, gold-stamped invitation. "A private pre-launch tasting," Natalie said. "Only 10 seats. You'll be the first to try the production run." He made a small grunt of appreciation. "And Mr. Goodwin," she added, turning to me, "you're invited too. You were the one who saw what wasn't said." I inclined my head. "Thank you." She stood. "This may not be the cleanest victory, but I know who I am now, and who I can't afford to be." Wolfe gave her a rare glance of what could almost pass for admiration. "Miss Voss, the finest desserts are those that balance bitter with sweet. I trust you will remember that." She gave a short nod and left. We sat in silence for a while. "She's sharp," I said eventually. "Indeed. You think she'll make it?" "As long as she remembers that intelligence alone is insufficient, it must be tempered with clarity." I tilted my head. "That your final word on the matter?" "No," Wolfe said. "My final word is this. People who serve ice cream with ambition should remember, ambition melts." That was him being poetic. For Wolfe, practically a haiku. The rest of the day unfolded in typical brownstone fashion. Fritz baked an apple clafouti. Wolfe dictated a letter to a publisher, complaining about the misuse of the term gastronomic in a new cookbook, and I reorganized our office files while wondering if Equinox would live up to the hype. At exactly 6:30, Fritz served dinner, Cornish hen with morel sauce and buttered leeks. Wolfe ate with satisfaction but said little. When dessert came, caramel custard with vanilla bean shards, he paused halfway through, set his spoon down and turned to me. "Archie." "Yeah? Next week, if Miss Voss sends another case of flavors, I want them logged and catalogued." "Because of the drama?" "No, because the strawberry basil was misfiled last time. And I suspect Fritz ate the second chocolate." I smirked. "So the sanctity of the flavor vault must be preserved." "Exactly." And with that, the great detective leaned back, closed his eyes, and let justice and cream settle into equilibrium once more. By the following Wednesday, life at the brownstone had returned to its usual equilibrium. Wolfe was firmly entrenched in his daily routine: orchids from 9 to 11, lunch at precisely 1, dinner no earlier than 7, and I was back to manning the phones, managing the books, and trying to find creative ways to avoid the mountain of case files waiting to be cross-referenced. But underneath the calm there was still a faint scent of unfinished business, like a souffle that hadn't quite risen. I didn't say anything to Wolfe, not yet, but something had been picking at me for days. It had started as a tickle, a mental itch I chalked up to caffeine withdrawal or the sudden absence of adrenaline, but it kept growing, stubborn and insistent. The Drexler identity, Kieran's betrayal, Natalie's setup, Noemi's quiet sabotage, they all fit together but like puzzle pieces trimmed to fit the wrong box. The picture was complete, but blurry. Something was still off. It wasn't until Thursday morning, while flipping through the Creme Voss promotional material Natalie had left behind, that it clicked. The flavor description. I'd read it before. But this time the phrasing snagged. Infused with saffron and cardamom, swirled with golden caramel and a whisper of rose, crafted with Michelin expertise and the intuition of New York's most discerning palate. Now, Wolfe doesn't care. 4-brand copy unless it's printed on a wine label or menu, but I've had to read enough of the stuff in client files to recognize something odd when I see it. Michelin expertise was a reference to Noemi, obviously. But New York's most discerning palate? That was a detail Natalie had never said out loud. Not to Wolfe, not to me. But it had shown up on her final promotional sheet. Before the relaunch and rebranding, there was only one person in New York known for using that phrase about himself. I stood up, grabbed the folder, and strode into Wolfe's office. He looked up from a copy of Cicero on duty and blinked. "Something tragic has occurred, I assume?" "Something stupid, actually." "On our part." I handed him the sheet. He scanned it once. Then again, slower. "When?" His eyes narrowed. I knew I had him. "She used your phrase," I said, "word for word." "She did. And you never told her you called yourself that." "I did not." "So where'd she get it?" He set the paper down with the careful precision of a man who'd just been served a cold risotto. "She overheard it." I nodded. "Which means she was here before she was here." That was the moment the real story began to reshape itself, with Wolfe's approval, granted via a simple, "Go, verify." I dug into Natalie Voss's calendar from the weeks before she first walked into our office. Not an easy task, since she kept her appointments close and her explanations closer, but Fritz let it slip that he'd received a phone call from a young woman asking about Mr. Wolfe's dessert preferences 2 weeks prior to her arrival. That was enough. I backtracked her calls through a friend at the phone company. Yes, I know a few still exist, and confirmed it. Natalie had called the brownstone 11 days before the case began. Not from her main number, but from a second line registered to Creme Voss's private tasting division. Then I went to Saul. He had better resources and fewer scruples. Within 6 hours, he'd confirmed that Natalie had been at a private dessert showcase at the same Upper West Side culinary club where Wolfe's name had been used, offhandedly by a journalist in reference to Wolfe's supposed infallible dessert judgment. She'd been in the room. She'd known exactly who Wolfe was before she ever stepped foot through our front door, which meant that her sudden plea for help, her offer of pints as peace tokens, the supposed urgency of the sabotage, it had all been crafted. We'd been scouted. That evening, Wolfe didn't rage, he didn't sputter, he didn't throw Natalie's name into the trash with the used tarragon. He simply said, "She played to my appetite, not my reason." And it worked. I said yes. She brought the pints knowing they would pass Fritz's muster. She baited you with taste, then fed you the problem with just enough intrigue and just enough ambiguity to spark your detestation of disorder. You fell for it. Wolfe gave me a look that would have curdled milk. "I am not infallible, Archie." "Believe me," I said. "I know." But this time she didn't just outmaneuver the enemy. She outmaneuvered us. She needed a controlled response, Wolfe said. She couldn't afford police, press, or even a messy accusation. She required strategy, and she found it. She used us as a scalpel. No, as a spoon. He stood, a rare event, moved to the globe, rested his fingers on the wooden rim. She had reason, he said, and she achieved equilibrium, but at a cost. You still admire her. I respect the precision of her deceit, he turned back to me, but she is no longer a client. I will not dine with her. I will not accept her flavors. That, for Wolfe, was the equivalent of exile. I nodded. Do we tell her we know? No. Let her keep the illusion. It is the least damaging punishment she could receive. And the rest? We wait. For what? For her next failure. 2 days later, a box arrived, addressed to me, not Wolfe. A handwritten note sat inside on simple cream paper. Archie, I know he knows. I suspected he would, but I hoped you would understand why I did what I did. I had no other way. The world we live in doesn't reward purity, only performance. You two are performers too, in your own way. I just choreographed the stage. This is the last gift. No strings. Call it closure. And inside the box was a single pint, labeled Nocturne, a dark chocolate base with hints of fig and ghost pepper. Limited release. No brand. No barcode. I put it in the freezer. 3 nights later, Fritz found it and served it with fresh cherries. Wolfe tasted 1 bite, closed his eyes, and said nothing. But the next morning, he gave me a note to type, a letter to Braemar, declining the invitation to the Equinox launch, and just like that, the balance was restored. The brownstone had its quiet. The orchids bloomed, the eggs arrived on schedule, and Wolfe, having tasted ambition in its most decadent form, retreated to his books and buttered toast with the quiet certainty of a man who, once again, knew exactly what the world was, deceitful, brilliant, and occasionally well-flavored. 2 weeks passed. Enough time, I figured, for the flavor of betrayal to fade, at least on the tongue. Wolfe had resumed his routine with a vengeance. Breakfast, shirred eggs with truffle salt. Orchids from 9 to 11, of course. Then a grim sort of silence that filled the office like fog from a kettle left boiling just a bit too long. I'd seen it before, this quiet, this inward fold he did when a case left a residue. It wasn't disappointment in the client or the crook. It was disappointment in himself. Not that Wolfe would say it out loud. He'd rather eat store-bought mayonnaise, but I knew. The great Nero Wolfe had been played like a fiddle, tuned with whipped cream and cardamom. I kept things moving. Reports filed, bills paid, Saul updated. Lon Cohen fed the version of events we were willing to have in print. corporate sabotage. Averted thanks to anonymous intervention. Clean, neat, no ice cream metaphors. It was a Tuesday when the next knock came at the brownstones' door. Late afternoon, the light gone grey, the sky promising spring and delivering nothing but wind. I opened it expecting a package, maybe more promotional nonsense from someone trying to get Wolfe's endorsement. What I got instead was a man who looked like he'd walked out of a noir film reel. He was tall, tailored and tired, mid-50s with thick salt and pepper hair and a cane that looked more for image than necessity. His eyes, pale blue and sharp, locked onto mine like I was a chess piece he didn't want to use, but might have to. "Archie Goodwin, you've got him. My name is Leo Stratham. May I speak to Mr. Wolfe?" I gave him a quick scan. Rolex. Subtle. Cufflinks that weren't showy but custom. The look of a man who didn't have to try, which usually meant he tried harder than anyone. "What's the subject?" I asked. He hesitated. "A matter of acquisition." Wolfe doesn't. Broker deals. This one may involve a crime. That got my attention. I stepped aside and let him in. Wolfe didn't get up when I showed Stratham into the office. He rarely does unless the building's on fire or Fritz announces a sauce has split. He gave the man one of his brief nods, and I made the introductions. Stratham didn't sit right away. He looked around the room, at the globe, the bookshelves, the beer bottles on the tray, then finally lowered himself into the red armchair like a man entering a confessional. "I represent a group of investors preparing to acquire Braemar Foods," he began. "You may be aware of their current expansion negotiations." "I am," Wolfe said, his tone neutral. "We've been reviewing their product pipeline, partnerships, and recent vendor relations. One file, unusual, a boutique flavor supplier. Crème Vos." Wolfe's lips pressed together, a line of granite. "We've been told," Stratham continued, "that Braemar fast-tracked their contract under suspicious circumstances, that a rival flavor company lodged an informal complaint alleging intellectual property theft." I didn't blink. Wolfe didn't breathe. "I want to know," Stratham said, "whether Crème Vos is stable, whether this launch will embarrass us in 6 months. "That is a business inquiry," Wolfe said curtly. "No," Stratham said. "It's a question of truth. I've read your name in enough files to know the difference." Wolfe's eyes opened a little wider. That was as close as he'd come to intrigued. "Why not ask Braemar directly?" Wolfe asked. "They're protecting. They're partners. And Crème Vos is playing coy, but there's money moving, quickly, too quickly. Someone's either buying silence or selling success." He leaned forward. "I don't need the flavor, I need the facts." Wolfe gave him a long, deep look, then turned to me. "Archie, call Miss Vos. Request a visit. No formality. Say it is in her interest." I didn't ask questions. I just picked up the phone. Natalie came the next morning. I opened the door and found her already on the defensive. Sunglasses, lips pressed tight, hair back in a knot like a helmet. She stepped inside with brisk efficiency. I wasn't expecting. "To hear from you again," she said as I took her coat. "No one expects the Spanish Inquisition," I said, ushering her in. "But this is more polite." Wolfe was waiting. He didn't offer her a seat this time. She took one anyway. "Miss Vos," he said, "you are about to be acquired." She blinked. "Braemar?" "No. Braemar is to be acquired, and your contract is under scrutiny. I have been asked to assess whether it will survive examination." She gave a tight smile. "You mean whether I'll survive it?" Semantics. Natalie crossed her legs, a controlled gesture. "You think I lied again?" "I think," Wolfe said, "you orchestrated a deception so intricate you lost track of its ripples. A rival, Alpine Creamery, accused you of theft. You silenced them through exposure. But if they have any material proof of that flavor's duplication, the scandal will outlive the facts." "There is no proof," she said. "No documentation, no formula, nothing concrete." "Unless," Wolfe said, Someone saved a copy, or a sample, or a statement. Her face didn't change, but her eyes blinked once, slow and hard. Noemi, I said quietly. She made a second batch, gave it to Wender, and he, being clever but not careful, likely kept something for insurance. He's in hiding, she said. Men like Wender don't hide, Wolfe said. They wait. She didn't answer. Wolfe sighed. Miss Voss, I am not your judge. But if you intend to survive in business, understand this. Even a lie that protects you is still a weapon you've handed your enemy. What do you want me to do? She asked, her voice just above a whisper. Settle quietly. Pay Wender for silence, or admit his contribution and defang the accusation. I can't, she said. The brand can't absorb a scandal. Then, Wolfe said, it may soon be someone else's brand. She rose, slowly, and for once without confidence. I thought I was playing the game, she said, but I built it on a trapdoor. Indeed, Wolfe said, and forgot to memorize. The exit. After she left, Wolfe didn't say anything for a while. I brought him his beer unopened. He looked at the label like it might hold answers. She'll pay him, I said. Of course, but it won't be enough. You think she'll lose the company? Eventually, if not to Wender, then to someone else. She has the palate, not the constitution. I leaned on the edge of his desk. So what now? Now, Wolfe said, we watch, and we remember. Remember what? He opened his eyes. That in a world where flavor is currency, deceit is merely seasoning. 3 days later, a letter arrived by post. No logo, no return address, no scent of marketing perfume or embossed brand pageantry, just plain ivory cardstock, hand-folded and sealed with a red wax insignia I didn't recognize. Wolfe's name was written on the front in elegant masculine handwriting. That meant it wasn't from Natalie Voss. Her handwriting was smaller and looped like she was used to signing gift cards and ribbon tags. I handed it to Wolfe without a word. He took it without looking up from the Journal of Pomology and Horticultural Science. He slit the seal with his desk knife, unfolded the paper, and read in silence. I waited, and waited some more. Then, Archie, it appears the game is still in progress. Rematch? A warning. He passed me the letter. It was short and formal, but with an edge sharp enough to slice butter at 10 paces. Mr. Wolfe, you were correct in your assessment. Miss Voss will attempt a quiet arrangement with Mr. Wender. The sum, however, is larger than anticipated. Your inquiries have forced his price higher. If you continue to interfere, directly or indirectly, you may find that the business of desserts becomes unpleasantly bitter. Respectfully, a friend of flavor, I read it twice. That's not from Wender. No, Wolfe agreed. He is too brash, too impatient. This is someone else. A third player? An observer, Wolfe said. One with stakes not yet visible. I felt a familiar knot begin to form in my gut, the kind that usually meant we weren't dealing with a neat end after all. I said, you think there's another competitor? I think, Wolfe said, folding the letter with surgical precision, there is a party who benefits from continued instability at Crème et Voss, and from the appearance that Wender still holds leverage. He stood, a rare second time in a week, and walked to the globe, spun it once, then stopped it with a fingertip. You told me, he said, that Natalie rebranded the flavor as Equinox. Right, symbolic, balance of light and dark, fancy marketing speak. But her instincts run closer to conflict than harmony, Wolfe said. Her choice was aspirational, not accurate. I nodded slowly. And someone's keeping her in. Conflict. Wender's not acting alone? Or not anymore, which means we need to look again. Not at what was taken, but at who was watching. So I went back to the beginning. I reviewed our notes from the day Natalie first arrived. What she wore, what she said, how she presented the theft. It was all carefully constructed. But Wolfe was right. Someone else had watched it unfold, and whoever they were still watching. I checked surveillance near the Kremid Voss flagship store. A contact at the precinct owed me a favor. I asked for access to camera feeds from the alleyway behind the shop from the day before and after the alleged break-in. We already knew there was no actual theft, but that didn't mean no one came sniffing around. Sure enough, there was a face we'd missed. Saturday night, just before midnight. A man in a long coat standing at the alley's mouth. He didn't go in, just lingered for 4 minutes, then left. The timestamp lined up almost perfectly with when Felix Mancuso, the night cleaner, claimed to have heard footsteps. He was telling the truth, but we'd looked in the wrong direction. The man's face was partly obscured, but good enough for a match. I ran it through our internal suspect file, the one Wolfe pretends he doesn't know. I keep. And there he was, Victor Tazzini, food consultant. Legal troubles in 2 states. Specialized in brand erosion services, whatever that meant. Fired from a Braemar-adjacent packaging firm 5 years earlier for leaking proprietary data to a competitor. No convictions, but lots of whispers. The kind of guy who never gets photographed with a fork in hand, but always shows up when recipes go missing. I brought the file to Wolfe that evening. He nodded once. I remember him. He said. He attempted to retain me in 2015 to suppress a whistleblower in a tuna mislabeling scheme. I refused. Think he's working with Wender? Possibly. Or simply exploiting him. What's the angle? Chaos, Wolfe said. Tazzini profits from disruption. If Wender destabilizes Natalie and Braemar hesitates, another client steps in. Perhaps even one paying Tazzini to delay the launch. A rival creamery, or a distributor, a packaging partner, anyone who bet against Kremid Voss and now fears they were wrong. He looked at me. Find him. I found him. It wasn't hard. Guys like Tazzini always show up at trade events, dressed like they belong but never standing under the spotlight. He was at a boutique expo in Brooklyn, mingling with suppliers. I tailed him for an hour, watched him laugh with a logistics exec, shake hands with someone in dried fruit exports. Finally, he slipped into a side room for a private tasting. I followed. I didn't kick the door in, I'm not a cartoon, but I waited until he stepped out. Mr. Tazzini, I said. He froze, then smiled. Mr. Goodwin, how's Mr. Wolfe's appetite? Peaked when we realized someone was still stirring the pot. Ah, he said, but pot stirring is a necessary evil in cuisine, no? You've been pressuring Wender. He's unstable. You're giving him teeth he doesn't have. On the contrary, Tazzini said, adjusting his cuffs, I'm giving him a leash. Without me, he'd have ruined Miss Voss weeks ago. What's your endgame? He tilted his head. I'm simply maintaining market tension. I stepped closer. Drop Wender, or Wolfe names you to Braemar's legal team as a source of commercial tampering. His smile thinned. You wouldn't. You're betting I won't. But you'd be wrong. He didn't blink, but he adjusted his cuffs again. I'll advise Mr. Wender to stand down, he said at last. You'll advise him to vanish. He gave me a nod that could have been a bow or a bluff, then walked away without another word. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe absorbed my report in silence. When I finished, he turned to the window and said, We have reached the end of the true affair. Tazzini backs off, Wender disappears, Natalie keeps her company. For now. You don't think it's done? Nothing in the culinary world is ever truly finished, Wolfe said. Only plated. He turned to me, hands folded. We were used, Archie. First by Natalie, then by Wender, then by a man who profits from the appearance of instability. And now? Now we restore silence. He looked at the untouched letter on his desk, the one signed, A Friend of Flavor. Then, softly, he said, Send it back. That Friday morning, the return letter went out. Wolfe's doing, not mine. He dictated it while I typed, his voice calm, his diction clipped. He addressed it simply, "To the party whose interference has proven excessive." No names, no accusations, no flair. Just a single-page rebuke of mischief in the guise of market strategy. The tone was pure Wolfe, restrained wrath, laced with moral superiority, garnished with a final flourish that suggested whoever had dared disturb his intellectual garden would do well not to try again. Then it was done, or should have been. By Saturday, Wolfe was back to glowering at cookbooks, and Fritz was preparing a menu with early spring greens and smoked duck, acting like none of us had ever heard of crème Vos or Victor Tazzini or a dessert called Equinox. I even heard Wolfe hum very briefly during his 11 o'clock orchid tending, which is as close as the man comes to contentment. But that same day, around 3 p.m., a knock came at the door that froze the entire brownstone in its tracks. This time it wasn't a package or a rival or a criminal with a confession. It was Natalie Voss again. She stood on the stoop in a trench coat, no sunglasses, no curated smile, and a pint of ice cream under her arm. Not in a branded carton, but a plain silver tin like something you'd find in a test kitchen. No label, no slogan, just a steel and cold. "I know I shouldn't be here," she said as I opened the door. "But I have to talk to him." I hesitated. Wolfe had made it clear. No more visits, no more favors. But something about the way she stood, straight-backed but sagging just slightly at the shoulders, told me this wasn't about business. "Wait here," I said. I returned a minute later. "He'll give you 5 minutes." She didn't thank me. She just stepped in. Wolfe remained seated behind his desk when she entered, arms folded across the yellow silk of his vest, a bottle of brown beer unopened beside him. He didn't nod. He didn't speak. Natalie placed the silver tin on his desk like an offering at an altar. "Before you say anything," she began, "this isn't an apology." "Good," Wolfe said. "It's a truth." She exhaled slowly. "Tazzini approached me before I ever came to you, months ago. He offered insight, strategy. He told me Braemar could be swayed, that we needed to shake our competitors, give them a story they couldn't replicate. And you listened," Wolfe said. "I listened. I didn't agree, not then, but the idea stuck. When I realized Kieran was leaking our pitch, I panicked. I staged the theft. I made it look like sabotage. Then I came to you. Not because I wanted justice, but because I wanted control. You succeeded. For a while." She looked down at her hands, then back at him. "When Wenda surfaced, I realized I'd started something I couldn't manage, but I still thought I could spin it. Until I saw your letter to Tazzini." Her voice caught just slightly. "He's afraid of you. Do you know that? Not because of your name or your clients or your influence, but because you're the one man in this city he can't predict." "I'll accept that as an observation," Wolfe said. She tapped the tin. "This is the final version, Equinox. It goes into production next week. I brought it because I wanted you to taste it, not as a client, as a consequence." "Of your ambition?" "Of my actions." She stepped back. "I won't contact you again, but I needed you to know I never intended to play you. Only to solve a problem I created." Wolfe didn't move, didn't speak, just stared. Then he nodded once. "Good day, Miss Voss." She left. He didn't open the tin until after dinner. Fritz had prepared a citrus-glazed poussin with grilled radicchio and wild rice, and for dessert, something uncharacteristically humble, vanilla pudding with shaved white chocolate, but Wolfe didn't touch it. He lifted the lid from the silver tin instead, examined the dense, frozen contents, and scraped a modest spoonful into his dish. Fritz hovered at the doorway, curious. "It's her final version?" he asked. Wolfe tasted, closed his eyes, chewed slowly. I watched, waiting for a grunt of approval or a sigh of resignation, but Wolfe merely said, "She has talent." "That's it?" I asked. "She has talent," he repeated. "But she lacks restraint." He pushed the tin away. It is brilliant, but too much, too loud. The rose overtakes the saffron. The fig is buried. The balance promised in the name is not achieved. But marketable? Undoubtedly, I whistled. So the dessert world keeps turning. Wolfe raised an eyebrow. As does the world itself, with or without my appetite. That night I typed the final memo on the case, titled it The Ice Cream Interrogation, as a nod to Wolfe's methodical breakdowns and the layers beneath each flavor and face. I filed it under deceptions, non-violent, next to the deviled egg affair and the pastry complication. Wolfe may not have solved a murder this time, but something had been killed all the same. The illusion that food and truth don't mix. As I closed the file drawer, I realized something. Wolfe hadn't won this case the usual way. He hadn't unmasked a killer, delivered a culprit to Kramer, or unspooled the motives in a final crescendo before a crowd of suspects. He'd merely watched, waited, let them undo themselves. Because sometimes the smartest thing you can do is let the flavors settle and see which ones rise. The next morning I passed by the freezer and found the tin gone, not in the trash, not on Wolfe's desk, not among Fritz's supplies. I didn't ask, but later I noticed a single phrase written in Wolfe's hand, tucked into the margin of his tasting journal, equinox, transitory, like all things that pretend to be balanced. It was over, but not like a curtain falling at the end of a play. More like the way snow falls in Central Park after the last tourist leaves, quiet and unacknowledged. Wolfe didn't discuss the case after that final spoonful of equinox, and I didn't press him. When Nero Wolfe draws the blinds on a case, you can shout from the sidewalk, but he won't reopen the window. Still, the story had to settle somewhere. So I kept my ears open and my feet moving. A week after Natalie's last visit, Wender resurfaced, but only to sign a confidentiality agreement and accept an undisclosed payout. He vanished again, likely to reinvent himself as E. Drexler in whatever niche market hadn't yet heard of him. I gave the tip to Saul, who grunted and filed it under nuisance-level threats with delusions of leverage. Victor Tazzini, the gourmet ghost in the machine, did exactly what Wolfe predicted. He disappeared from the Braemar orbit, showing up instead in a new partnership with a Japanese frozen dessert startup. Subtler targets, Wolfe said. Less scrutiny. More mischief. As for Natalie Voss, she made the front page of the New York Culinary Review 2 weeks later, photographed with a small golden spoon in one hand and the first pint of Equinox in the other. The caption read, "Balance at last. Creme Voss breaks through." I showed the article to Wolfe during lunch. He didn't look at it. "She will thrive," he said, spearing a marinated artichoke. "Until she doesn't. You think she'll burn out? She believes performance can be sustained by appetite alone. That is a mistake. But the flavor's a hit. For now." He sipped his beer, slowly. "She is clever. But cleverness, untethered from character, becomes strategy without substance." That was Wolfe's final judgment on Natalie Voss. Not a criminal, not innocent, just human, brilliant, and dangerous in equal measure. Later that evening, I found myself in the office alone, sipping coffee and thinking about how it had all unfolded. No one died. No one was arrested. But people had been betrayed, deceived, manipulated. Wolfe had once said that justice didn't always wear a badge or carry a warrant. Sometimes justice was just the restoration of stillness, of order. And this case, for all its twists and melts and motives, had restored something. Not balance exactly, but clarity. We'd been used, but not broken, played, but not fooled. And Wolfe, well, he'd been reminded that even the most refined palate can be tempted by flavor over fact. It was a lesson, served cold. I was closing up for the night when Fritz appeared at the doorway, wiping his hands on a cloth. "There's a package," he said. "From a bakery in Montreal, no sender's name, but almond brittle and lavender." I raised an eyebrow. Wolfe's voice called from the dining room. "Return it." "Without tasting it?" I asked. He didn't answer. I smiled. That, I figured, was answer enough. So the brownstone returned to peace. The freezer remained stocked, the orchids unbothered, and Wolfe once again reclined in his chair like a man who had never left it. Justice had been served. In scoops, and if Wolfe's final remark on the whole affair was a muttered "Pfui," as he sipped his beer and refused dessert for the third night in a row, well, I took that as closure. As for me, I've decided I'll stick to chocolate chip you. I can trust it. It doesn't pretend to be anything it's not, just like Wolfe. And sometimes, just sometimes, that's enough to keep the world spinning straight.